If you were to step into a small theater in Texas today and see a man in his 80s performing before a packed audience, you might assume he must be a legend who once dominated the charts, an artist with a shelf full of major awards, a name forever tied to Nashville's golden era. But here's the strange part. That man has no Grammy, no Entertainer of the Year title, no long streak of #1 hits stretching across the years. In fact, throughout his entire career, he has had only one single song reach the top of the Billboard Country chart. So why is it that, after more than 50 years, Gene Watson is still being invited back onto the stage? Why do audiences still rise to their feet when he begins to sing, while many of the bigger stars from his era have faded into memory? There is something in his story that no chart could ever measure. And perhaps, to understand why Gene Watson never truly disappeared, we have to go back to where it all began. Long before the name Gene Watson ever appeared on the Billboard charts, he was simply a boy born in 1943 in the small town of Palestine, Texas. A place where dreams didn't begin beneath stage lights, but with the rumble of truck engines and the smell of motor oil. His family was working class. There was no conservatory, no piano in the living room, only an old radio, the one fragile thread that connected them to the outside world after long days of labor. It was through that radio that Gene first heard the voices of Ray Price and Lefty Frizzell. Those honky-tonk melodies didn't sing about fame. They sang about loneliness, about love falling apart, about men coming home after the night shift. It wasn't music for dreaming. It was music for surviving. Gene's childhood was not shaped by stage curtains. It was shaped by manual labor, by learning how to make a living before learning how to sing. Back then, music was not a career ambition. It was simply a quiet escape from a world where everything seemed decided the moment you were born. The early years of Gene Watson's journey did not begin beneath bright stage lights, but inside a small garage where he spent his days repairing engines, changing oil, and doing work that left his hands more familiar with cuts and grease than with guitar strings. But when the sun sank behind the red dust roads of Texas, his life began a second shift. Not with a wrench, but with a guitar. From cramped, smoke-filled honky-tonk bars to makeshift stages where the audience barely filled a few rows of chairs, Gene sang. Not for fame, but simply to survive one more day. By day, he made a living. By night, he kept the dream alive. For years, he mailed demo recordings to major record labels, waiting for a reply that might change his life. But all he received was rejection. His music was labeled too traditional, too old-fashioned, and out of step with Nashville's new direction. And then in 1975, when most people would have given up, Gene Watson decided to bet on himself. He used the little money he had to independently record a song titled Love in the Hot Afternoon. No marketing strategy, no famous producer, no guarantee of success, just a man who believed his voice deserved to be heard. At that time, his life was an endless loop with no days off, driving to work, laboring until his hands ached, performing until his throat burned raw, then starting all over again, exhausted, but never stopping. And then, after years of living inside an endless cycle of work days without rest, one of the songs Gene Watson had once paid to record out of his own pocket began receiving airplay on local radio. His name, for the first time, was spoken beyond the small bars of Texas. It was 1975 when Love in the Hot Afternoon unexpectedly broke into the top 10 of the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. For the first time, Gene Watson's life turned in a different direction. From a man financing his own recordings, he became an artist signed by Capitol Records. The small Texas stages were gradually replaced by larger theaters, performances before thousands, and applause that was no longer polite, but genuine recognition. Paper Rosie further secured his place as a vocalist who told stories through feeling. Then came Nothing Sure Looked Good on You, as a deeply honky-tonk ballad that carried Gene Watson's name further into the heart of Nashville. But it was Farewell Party that made audiences remember him. Not merely as a singer with a fine voice, but as a man who understood their sorrow. And then, in 1982, everything reached its peak. 14 Karat Mind climbed to #1 on the Billboard Country chart, becoming the only song in Gene Watson's career to ever reach the top. For the first time in his life, he stepped onto a stage before thousands, not as a man trying to be noticed, but as an artist who had been awaited. Yet at the very same moment, a new pressure began to form. Country music was changing. Synthesizers were slipping into recordings. The Nashville sound was becoming glossier, more commercial, more accessible. And amid the explosion of country pop, Gene Watson faced a question no chart could answer. Should he change his sound to hold on to success? But the pressure to change his sound did not remain confined to the stage. It followed him on long night drives, on the quiet return home after performances, and slowly seeped into the life he had once tried to keep separate from fame. Because while Gene Watson's career was unfolding in public view, his life behind the lights had to adjust to an entirely different rhythm. He married Mattie Louise Watson in 1961, long before there was a recording contract, before there were charts, before there was any reason to believe music would ever become a profession. That marriage would last more than 6 decades. But like any family living to the relentless tempo of touring, the months away from home, the overnight drives, the back-to-back performances, that endurance did not always come easily. And fame did not break his family apart, but it created distances that love could not always close immediately. There were seasons when the stage seemed closer than his own front door. And in those moments, Gene and Mattie's marriage was not tested by scandal, but by absence. They chose to raise their children in Texas, far from the center of Nashville, not because they couldn't live there, but because they wanted to protect a part of their lives from being defined by stage lights. Off stage, Gene Watson became known as disciplined and private, avoiding after-show parties, steering clear of the lifestyle many of his peers embraced just to survive. For him, music was the work, but family was the place to return to. But not every pressure Gene Watson carried home could be left at the door. Some things followed him. They followed him into the car, followed him into the studio, followed him even into evenings that were meant to belong to his family. Because just as his career began touching its peak in the early 1980s, the country music industry was already shifting in another direction. The sound grew glossier, the rhythms more accessible. Records were increasingly crafted for radio play, not simply to tell a story. And in that new world, Gene Watson's music, with its steel guitar, fiddle, and aching honky-tonk melodies, began to be seen as outdated. No one told him outright that he no longer fit, but he could feel it in the way his songs were played less and less. Tracks that once slipped easily into the top 10 now struggled just to be noticed. Large venues gave way to smaller touring circuits. Not because he sang any worse, not because audiences turned their backs, but because the market had begun listening for a different sound. And when radio falls silent, an artist does not disappear overnight. They simply travel farther. Another city, another state, another show, to make up for what no longer comes through the airwaves. The tours grew longer, the returns home grew shorter. There were nights when Gene stood before hundreds of applauding fans. While back at home, dinner had long since gone cold. His tragedy did not arrive in scandal. It did not come with a dramatic collapse. It came slowly. The moment he realized that to keep surviving in this industry, he would have to make a choice. Change his sound to fit the times, or hold on to his identity and accept being left behind. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing for an artist is not being hated. It is being forgotten. But there is one thing radio cannot do. It can stop playing your music, but it cannot stop others from learning how to sing because of you. While Gene Watson's songs slowly faded from the airwaves, a new generation of country artists began returning to the very sound he had never abandoned. They listened to the way he stretched a lyric, the way he refused to rush a melody, the way a ballad could be told without being polished simply to sell. For many of the younger artists who would later pursue the honky-tonk revival, Gene Watson was not a chart-topping star. He was a standard, proof that country music does not have to become more modern in order to survive. 14 Karat Mind may have been the only song that carried him to #1 on the Billboard Country chart, but his influence was never found in rankings. I see it lives in the way later voices still choose to keep the steel guitar in their recordings, still choose to tell sad stories instead of chasing catchy hooks, still choose to sing as if the audience is sitting right in front of them, not on the far end of a marketing campaign. In the years that followed, Gene Watson received nominations from the ACM and CMA for Top Male Vocalist. And in 2002, he was inducted into the Texas Country Music Hall of Fame. But perhaps his true legacy does not rest in nominations or titles. It rests in the fact that the very sound once dismissed as too traditional became a source of inspiration for those who wanted to bring country music back to itself. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about Gene Watson's life today is that it does not feel like a final chapter, but rather like a continuation written at a slower pace. His mornings no longer begin in a Nashville recording studio. There are no calls from record labels, no broadcast schedules to monitor, just a home in Texas where music is no longer a strategy, but a habit. Sometimes he still picks up his guitar in the afternoon, not to rehearse for a new album, but simply to keep his hands familiar with the sound that has followed him all his life. Touring now is chosen with greater care. No more months-long journeys, no more back-to-back nights across multiple states, just a handful of shows each year in small theaters, at traditional country festivals. That's where audiences do not come searching for the next trend, but to hear again a familiar voice. When he steps onto the stage, the applause is no longer for a hit single. It is for a man who never abandoned his sound even when the world around him changed. Gene's voice now no longer reaches as high as it once did, but each lyric seems to carry more years within it. Farewell Party is no longer just a song in the set list. It is a memory shared between him and those who grew up with his music. And then after the show, he returns home. Not to a party, not to a boardroom, but to the same place that waited for him through all those touring years. Gene Watson's life today is not about reclaiming a peak. It is about still being invited onto the stage when he chooses to step there. And as the tours gradually grow fewer, as the stage lights no longer rise every weekend, Gene Watson has more time to look back on his journey. A journey not marked by towering trophies, no Grammy, no Entertainer of the Year title, and yet something has remained for more than 5 decades. The audience. The people who still come to hear him sing, not because he is topping the charts, but because that voice once carried them through some of their hardest years. For Gene, music was never a race. It was a commitment to the sound he chose back when he stood in small Texas bars. A commitment that did not change simply because the market did. And perhaps what his story ultimately leaves behind is not a formula for fame, but a reminder. Not every artist has to change in order to survive. And then, like every performance before it, the stage slowly fades to black. The final light goes out. The audience rises from their seats. All that remains is a single microphone standing quietly in the vast empty space. Gene Watson's story does not close with a grand victory. There is no dramatic comeback, no final peak to prove anything at all. Just a journey held steady through time, because sometimes an artist's greatest success is not rising quickly, but lasting long enough to stay. If this story has made you reflect on the value of staying true to music, to the past, or to yourself, leave a comment below. In your view, what is it that allowed Gene Watson to endure for so long?